Hi, good morning. I am Tim Robinson. I'm married to Alison. We have one 15-year-old son, Daniel, and we are serving in Nigeria. We work with Wycliffe Bible translators whose desire it is to see every person and community on this planet transformed by Scripture. Similar to every church and mission organisation everywhere, we want to see transformed lives. We see our part of that global transformational picture as recognizing the expertise required to translate the Scriptures so that everybody, every church, and every ministry has the primary tool that they need in the languages that they need it in order to fulfill what God has called them to do. Nobody can be successful in discipleship or outreach or preaching or worship without Scripture that people can understand, access, utilize, and be transformed by. So in Nigeria, we're involved in serving the 520 language communities here. Between the various partner organizations that are working in this ministry, and there are about 100 translation projects on the go. But there are still at least 240 communities that don't have any scripture yet in their own language. It's a lot of work to do. When I heard that Elim missionaries were being asked to do these devotionals, I felt like I didn't actually have much capacity to get involved. Although we are in lockdown and work from home, I feel like I'm busier than ever. However, when I found out which church was asking, I had to get involved. Back when I was at university in Sunderland, Monk Wearmouth Christian Fellowship, as New Springs was known at the time, really impacted my life. It saved me from despair. It helped foster friendships that actually still exist today. And that church will always be special to me. And so I wanted to somehow make a contribution back to what you guys are doing at the moment. It's brilliant. Now, I have to confess that I've written this devotional without being able to see or hear what everyone else has done or said. But I hope there is a nugget in here somewhere that will encourage you at this time. So I'm supposed to be looking at Acts 25, which is right in the middle of Paul's situation. He's been accused of a bunch of stuff, and there's loads of things going on. He's being presented before a whole different series of people. He's been accused of being disruptive. He's been accused of inciting riots. We start the chapter where Festus has just taken over from Felix, who hasn't yet resolved the situation. And in the midst of the discussion, Paul tactfully plays the "I'm a Roman" card. Don't hand me over to the Jews and let them kill me. And whilst he's in front of the Roman leaders in a Roman court, Paul appeals to Caesar. There's a visiting king that appears in the middle of it all, and he's interested enough that he also wants to hear Paul's story. However, chapter 5 does not resolve the situation, so you will have to read it for yourself, carry on reading the next 3 chapters, and keep tuning in to find out what actually happens. As I've read the chapter, I've been sort of pondering, well, what's really in this for us? I mean, a description of a court case of somebody who's been falsely accused, may as well be a TV show or a movie. It doesn't really feel like one of those chapters that goes, "Hey, you Christians, this is what I want you to do." But here's the nuggets that really captured me. Paul knew his culture. He knew it well enough that he could make it work for his advantage. As cross-cultural workers, we often find ourselves trapped between 2 worlds. It can sometimes be hard to figure out what is the best course of action, especially when those 2 worlds seem to collide. Your home culture makes you think one thing and would respond one way, yet you're in a host culture that operates differently and would have a different. How do you reconcile the two things together and decide what to do next? And sometimes we're at odds, and that can cause frustration. In those times, we have to remind ourselves that God is the creator. He created all things, including those cultures and those differences. And I think sometimes in that you find some peace to go, actually, just because it's different doesn't mean it's wrong. But you've got to balance that with, okay, what is actually biblical in the midst of this? I think in Nigeria, some of the stereotypes would be about corruption. And you end up in situations often here where, you're trying to follow a normal process, get your driving license renewed or something, and next thing you're in the office and someone's asking you for some unreceipted money to help process your application. Well, what's the right and wrong in that? Personally, I try to avoid paying, unreceipted extras. I feel like that's a bribe. I don't think that's, the right way of doing things. Sometimes that means I then suffer as a consequence. I have to wait longer. But those are decisions that we all have to make all of the time. Okay, I think many people who find themselves now in isolation or lockdown or quarantine or whatever word you would like to describe your scenario, it is a bit like being stuck between the life you knew before and the life that you're having to live now. How do you figure that out and navigate through the mess? How do you deal with the grieving of missing the things you used to be able to do, the loss of freedoms, etc., etc.? Those are tough things. But those are also things that missionaries experience regularly. However, it doesn't get any easier. Every time there's that feeling, you have to process it, take it before the cross and lay it down. Paul lost his freedoms when he was arrested. And in this chapter, he's learning to navigate through that mess. On one hand, he's a Roman and he knows his culture. On the other hand, he's dealing with Jewish accusers that actually operate different law, and the consequences of those laws are different. And he's trying to say, well, how do we figure this out in the middle of that? So Paul is experiencing some of that cross-cultural tension. The second thing about this whole scenario is Paul is fighting for his freedoms. And I don't believe that Paul is fighting because of fear. I don't think he's afraid of dying. I don't think that's the point. But I think Paul firmly believed that God wasn't done with him yet. And so Paul's fighting to get through this and out the other side was so that he could still, participate in seeing God's kingdom built. I think as missionaries, I think as Christians, I think as human beings, we've got to fight to get through this in order to continue being used by God to build his kingdom. Things are never going to be the same after this. It's not like we're going to go back to normal, but we still have to fight to get through it, to get past the point of our fear, and so that we can then see what is God going to do with us now, what is God going to do through us now at this time in the situations that we are in and in the condition that the world is in. However, we still have to fight that feeling of, I'm going to ignore what we're being asked to do in terms of staying home and staying safe and protecting the NHS, etc. We've got to fight those feelings, even though we feel like we've lost our freedoms. In the middle of the chapter, there's a couple of amazing verses that sort of describe Paul's mindset. In verse 18 and 19, we find Festus, who is chatting with Agrippa, the visiting king. And this is his description of the situation. He's saying about Paul, but the accusations made against him weren't any of the crimes I expected. Instead, it was something about their religion and a dead man named Jesus, who Paul insists is alive. Isn't it fascinating? Of all the things he's been accused of, the crux of the issue is really that Paul was insisting Jesus is alive. In the midst of all that is going on, we can see that Paul was taking a stand for truth. Jesus is alive. I believe that. I'm sure you believe that. And I pray that we will be able to remember that and stand on that truth each day. See, because Jesus is alive, we have hope. We have life. We have a future. And we have freedom in him, even if we can't leave the house. Thanks for joining me today.